Hello, everyone, and welcome to phyloseminar.org. The current theme is the fossilized birth-death process, and this is the second talk in a series of 3 talks on that topic. Please use the YouTube live comment box to ask questions. Today's speaker is Dr. Rachel Warnock. Rachel did her PhD at the University of Bristol with Philip Donahue, then postdocs at the Smithsonian with Peter Wagner, and ETH Zurich with Tanja Stadler. Since last year, she has been a professor in the geology department at FAU, working on phylogenetics and quantitative paleobiology. Welcome, Rachel, and thank you for participating.
Thanks, Eric, for the really nice introduction. And I'm happy to be joining you from Germany. Like Eric said, this is the second in a series of talk on the fossilized birth-death process. And hopefully you got to check out April Wright's talk from last time. She gave a really terrific introduction to the topic. I'll be revisiting many of the concepts and the details that she introduced last week. Also, I hope you can catch us next time for Joël Burrido-Satani's talk on the challenges in applying some of these models in practice. So I'm going to begin by recapping the assumptions of the standard FBD process. So if we imagine the simplest set of assumptions that could be used to generate a tree in a macroevolutionary context, we have a speciation process, extinction process, and a sampling process of both extinct and extant taxa. And speciation and extinction and fossil recovery occur with a given rate. And then we sample species in the present with a given probability. So this gives rise to species origination events, extinction events, fossil sampling events, and sampling events of extant taxa. So for the origination, extinction, and fossil sampling, these events occur as outcomes of a Poisson process, meaning there's an exponential waiting time between these events. And typically we think of sampling in the present as a distinct process and assign this a probability. So each branch in this tree, as I've represented it, is a unique taxon. And this tree has some important features. One is that some taxa are only sampled once, and we refer to this in paleobiology typically as singletons. In addition, some lineages go completely unsampled. And we also have sampled ancestors that April described in detail in her talk. And we call this tree, which is an outcome of the complete process, the complete tree. So this includes all of our sampled and unsampled lineages. The FBD process allows us to calculate the probability of observing the reconstructed tree. So here I've drawn the unsampled portions of the tree I've highlighted these in gray. And when we eliminate these, we're left with the tree that is reconstructed based on the samples we observe. And this is what was described as the fossilized birth-death process, at least mathematically, in Tanja Stadler's paper in 2010. The first implementation was in Tracy Heat's paper in 2014, and this paper here from 2014 is where the model gets its name. But the fossilized birth-death process essentially provides us with an expression for calculating the probability of observing this incompletely sampled tree, given our fossil sampling times and the assumptions that I just described in the first slide, so speciation, extinction, and fossil recovery. The distribution of sampling times is what informs the model parameters, so speciation, extinction, and sampling rates, and this in turn leads to calculation of the branch durations. And you can think of this duration between the first appearance in the fossil record and the speciation or origination time. This is equivalent to what we often talk of as ghost lineages in paleobiology. But it's the distribution of fossil sampling times that informs our model parameters. This is where the branch lengths come from. So when we start including extinct or fossil samples in our tree, it's important that we consider what exactly do we mean when we're talking about these samples. In her talk, April very well described the age uncertainty that's associated with fossil samples. So we have, with any fossil sampled from the geological record, we have a range of ages associated with that specimen. And Joelle's done important work demonstrating the importance of taking this age uncertainty explicitly into account using the FBD process. But here I want to make clear the distinction between the age uncertainty that we associate with individual fossil specimens or samples and stratigraphic ranges. And stratigraphic ranges represent the duration between the first appearance of a taxa in the fossil record and the last appearance. Again, just emphasizing that in this tree, each branch represents a unique species. And here I'm also showing this taxa here, which is only sampled once. In this case, a singleton. And in this case, the first appearance and the last appearance are equivalent. So we only have this one sample. But when we have multiple samples, this duration in between first and last is what we refer to as stratigraphic ranges. And stratigraphic ranges are at the core of many of our analyses in quantitative paleobiology. In this paper that I contributed to that was led by Melanie Hopkins, we talk a lot about distinguishing these different variables and the importance of doing so. In recognition of the significance of stratigraphic ranges, in this paper in 2018, we introduced the fossilized birth-death range process. And this gives us an expression for calculating the reconstructed process, assuming that we sample, or given that we sample, stratigraphic ranges. So this means we have the FBD process for the analysis of specimen level data. And now we have, in addition, the FBD range process for the analysis of stratigraphic ranges. So to recap the model assumptions, so this is the graphical representation of the FBD model that April introduced last week. We have the origin time of the process, we have our speciation, extinction, and fossil recovery rates, and then our extant sampling probability. And the point I want to emphasize here is that the FBD standard process and the FBD range process make the same underlying assumptions. The difference is in having either specimen level data or stratigraphic ranges. But if you drew a graphical model for the FBD range process, it would look exactly the same.
Can you help me understand this a little? I'm guessing this is going to be important for the rest of the talk, so I want to understand. I mean, there's nothing that, I mean, the stratigraphic range data is effectively already in, if you have multiple samples of your fossil, it's already there.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point. So what I should have emphasized is that the additional information you have in this context is information about species through time. So when we implement the standard FBD process, we don't necessarily know or assign that these belong to the same taxa, that the individual samples are really capturing a distinct species through time, if you see what I mean. So we've got this additional layer of information within the FBD process, within the FBD range process.
So this is different than a usual phylogenetic tree in that all three of those nautiloids or whatever, they're all, like the fact that that's a straight line is actually data. That's not just a fact, part of the tree representation.
Yeah. So when you so in the FBD range process, you have this information that this taxa here, hopefully you can see my mouse, that this taxa here is a direct ancestor of this sample here, and that these represent the same species through time.
So why is that better than just having the three things in a row and saying that all three of those are the same?
So normally when we implement the specimen level process, we typically integrate out some of the topological uncertainty. So we might assign some of these samples to specific node in the tree, but typically we don't say, okay, this is a direct ancestor of this is a direct ancestor of this.
But you
if
are
see what I
saying
mean.
that exactly that type of thing in the stratigraphic range.
Yes. So these are two endpoints representing the duration of a species. And maybe another important thing to emphasize is that actually most of the data that we're using for analysis in paleobiology of phylogenetic trees is actually stratigraphic range data. And part of this is because like sometimes we actually don't have data available for the age of all the specimens in between the first and last appearance. And also the sampling process is like complex. So sometimes you have hundreds or even thousands of specimens in between the first and last appearance, and how you would designate these as a sort of individual sample might be quite tricky. So it also reflects the data that we have available. And if you have information about the number of occurrences in between the first and last appearance, you can also use that within the context of the FBD range process.
Okay,
but sometimes we don't know that information, so then we just integrate out the number of samples that could occur between the first and last appearance.
That's very helpful. And but like just in terms of like representation wise on the tree, like each of these stratigraphic ranges, they're sort of like a fixed chunk that if we're doing MCMC or something, we're going to like be moving this whole thing as a unit from place to place in the tree.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's very cool. I mean, this is like a different object than I've seen before. I've seen a lot of phylogenetics talks. I've never seen anything quite like this. That's awesome. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Eric. I hope that made that clearer for others as well. Yeah, so we're making the same assumptions as the original FBD model, but now we have this extra layer of information from including the duration of species through time. I just wanted to briefly mention that we can parameterize the process in different ways. We can directly apply priors to speciation, extinction, and fossil recovery rate, which we might want to do if we have information from the paleo literature about what these rates could be, and April presented an example of doing that last week. But alternatively, we could parameterize the model using this alternative set of parameters. I also wanted to highlight that we can also transform the fossil recovery rate into a per interval sampling probability, which is more commonly what we are used to encountering in paleobiology rather than this instantaneous rate of fossil recovery. But it's pretty straightforward using this framework to just transform these two parameters. In addition, we can also parameterize the process for epidemiology. Sasha Gavryshkina has presented the application of the FBD process in an epidemiological context in her 2014 paper. We can also apply the FBD range process in an epidemiological context. So last week, April talked about this hierarchical Bayesian approach to divergence time estimation. And she presented this tripartite model, which includes our substitution model and clock model that we use to model the process of molecular or morphological character evolution. And then we have our tree and tree model, which is where our fossil age information comes in. And although April went through this last time, I want to touch on these on this formula again, because I think it'll be useful when I come back to it later in the talk. So this is putting all these components into a Bayesian framework. So we have our priors on our model parameters. We have the probability of observing our time tree. And this is where the FBD model and the FBD range model come in. So that's what we use to calculate this probability. And then we have our likelihood, which typically comes from the substitution model. And then we have our marginal probability of the data and our posterior distribution that contains our estimated trees and our estimated model parameters. And I'm first going to talk about the application of the FBD range process for inferring time-calibrated trees. And I want to ask the question, does stratigraphic range data improve topological precision? So the idea of using stratigraphic range data to inform topological hypotheses is not new. And in particular, Peter Wagner proposed a number of quantitative approaches to reconciling trees that we may obtain using, for example, parsimony or alternative topological hypotheses, and reconciling these hypotheses with available stratigraphic range data. And the idea was that for a given proposed topology, or a set of topologies, the one that fit best with available stratigraphic range data could be considered the preferred one, because you're combining two different sets of evidence here. And this was done at the time before we had these explicit process-based models for combining evidence more directly, like we can do or achieve with the FBD process and the FBD range process. So there's been a number of recent work looking at the accuracy and precision afforded by including fossils in phylogenetic inference. And this is from a nice simulation study where the authors looked at the effects of including fossil terminals in phylogenetic inference. And they also looked at the impact of the proportion of missing data. And they looked at both the accuracy and precision, and they applied maximum parsimony analyses, undated Bayesian inference, and also dated Bayesian inference under the FBD model. And what they found was that even when we have a high degree of missing data, the inclusion of fossil terminals can help to improve phylogenetic accuracy and precision. And that's what we see with this trend here and again here. And so fossils offer tremendous value in terms of, or have tremendous potential for improving our phylogenetic inference. And to put this into even more context, so there's also been some nice empirical demonstrations that the inclusion of fossils can help resolve conflicts that arise between morphological and molecular data sets. And this is a nice example from looking at mammals. And then we have the study that I just showed on the last slide. And this suggests that fossil age information can improve phylogenetic accuracy. And in particular, even more so under the FBD process, when we also have this additional information about the fossil sampling times. But to add a caveat, in a study led by Joël, we showed that using simulations, that the inclusion of fossil age information under the FBD process may not help when the number of characters is very low. And so in this first study that I talked about up here, the total number of characters that fossils had was 300, although this could be up to 50% incomplete. But when in this study here, Joël focused on these extremely tiny data sets that are very characteristic of many matrices that we're working on in paleobiology. And so in this particular study under the standard or original FBD model, we found that the inclusion of fossil age information didn't seem to make a difference to phylogenetic precision or accuracy when we have such small morphological matrix. But we wanted to revisit this question now that we have the FBD range process. So this is project lead Pauline Genser, who's a paleobiologist and conodont expert, and this is Walker Pett, who implemented the FBD range model in RevBase. And our goal was to examine whether the inclusion of stratigraphic ranges can improve our phylogenetic resolution, or whether it can reduce the uncertainty associated with the trees inferred.
So we do have a question from the audience, which I think maybe you can say if you want to address it at the end. But Nicola Mueller asked, how certain can one be in the placement of fossils on individual branches, and what happens if they may be placed on the wrong branch?
Well, there Definitely going to sometimes be wrong, but when we take a Bayesian approach, hopefully we can represent the uncertainty associated with the position of the fossil. But maybe I can come back to that question again at the end.
And now that I've already interrupted you, so these. Okay, so I'm not super up on how people are using morphology. So these are these typically thought of as discrete morphological characters, and we're just looking at like a presence absence type thing, or are we looking at like continuous characters and some continuous model of their evolution?
So the vast majority of morphological matrices that are out there are discrete character data, and it could be either presence absence data or multi-state character data.
Number of wings or whatever.
Yeah. But I mean, we do have continuous trait data, and there's been a number of studies that have shown that if we can use this data, this is actually preferable, and we get more information from modeling continuous traits than we do from discrete data. But for the most part, the data that's available is discrete character data.
Great, thanks.
Okay. So the data set we use are conodonts, which are putative early vertebrates. And they're known mainly from their dental elements, which are shown here. These are tiny microfossils. And they're used extensively in biostratigraphy, so to date the age of rocks, especially in the Paleozoic. And so we used a classic data set that has appeared in the debate about whether we should use stratigraphy in tree inference. So this is 15 species that are all members of the genus Palaeontological, and we have 36 characters. And I think to molecular phylogeneticists, this sounds like an extremely tiny number of characters to be even bothering to estimate a phylogenetic tree. But this is extremely characteristic of the data sets that are available for any taxa from the Paleozoic, or even much more recent than that. In this particular case, this is an extremely comprehensive set of characters for conodonts. And I believe was the first data set to be analyzed using like a statistical phylogenetic approach. The ages date to the late Devonian. And so this is the first analysis of this data set from 2001. And this is a tree generated using parsimony. And then this tree is placed in a stratigraphic framework. But then this is like a subsequent figure from a follow-up paper in which the author developed a tree which is superimposed on top of the parsimony tree using a detailed study of the stratigraphic record. And the point he wanted to make here is that these trees are extremely distinct. So one in the background, this is the tree generated using parsimony and the morphological character matrix I described previously. And then the one superimposed on top was derived essentially manually through the kind of detailed study of the stratigraphy and the incomplete record of this group. This author argued that we should be using a sort of stratigraphic approach to generating trees rather than these tiny matrices that we like push into an algorithm. But now we have the FBD range process. We can now analyze this data in combination using this explicit model-based framework. And so this is what we did. So we performed unconstrained and time-constrained tree inference using the FBD range process in Rib Bayes. And here I'm showing the MCC trees On the left, the one obtained using unconstrained inference, and the one on the right, which is obtained using the FBD range process. And here we see this tree has a number of sampled ancestors. And then another thing to note about this diagram, so this color chart over here shows you the range of uncertainty. And characteristic of any tiny data set we have, or many tiny data sets, we have low resolution at many of the internal nodes. But superficially, apart from several differences, a few differences in the topology, superficially these trees look more or less the same in terms of the degree of uncertainty. But if we look out at the entire distribution of trees, we see something very interesting. So this is an ordinance-based tree space that shows the distribution of trees obtained using different approaches. So the undated trees are in these unfilled circles, and then the filled circles are those obtained using the FBD range process. And what you can see from this is that the FBD range trees occupy a smaller region of the tree space. And this shows that information about stratigraphic ranges can help to reduce uncertainty in the tree topology, even when we have an extremely low amount of characters. And this essentially showcases the strength of combining these two sets of data, character data, and temporal information in refining our phylogenetic hypotheses. However, we also want to emphasize that if we have these tiny character matrices, and if we're dealing with data sets and events that happened as much as 300 to 400 million years ago, we're going to have a large degree of uncertainty. And this is something that we have to accept when we do these analyses. And so it's unsatisfactory to summarize our results as a simple MCC tree. And so we also need to seriously consider the uncertainty associated with our trees and parameter estimates. So just to wrap up that process, that part of the talk, so does stratigraphic range information improve topological precision? Well, based on this empirical analyses, it does. So this is a very positive outlook for the application of the FBD range process in paleobiology. So far, we've been talking about this kind of modeling setup where you're trying to estimate divergence times in the scenario where you have both phylogenetic character data and fossil ages. But for the most part in paleobiology, and especially in the classic quantitative paleobiology studies, we almost exclusively only have fossil age information or fossil occurrence data, or even stratigraphic ranges. And so now I want to move on to talking about how we might use this modeling framework to estimate rates in this particular context. And specifically, I want to ask, can we improve estimates of origination and extinction rates using this approach? So here I'm showing a figure from Alroy 2008 that presents the number of genera over time, shown in black, and a measure of evenness over time. And this is the evenness of the geological record. And actually, maybe I got this the wrong way around. I think the lighter line is the number of genera, and the black line is a measure of the evenness of the geological record over time. And what you can see, if you're not used to looking at these graphs, is that there is a correlation, a complex correlation between the amount of rock available in the geological record and the estimates that we recover of species or higher level taxonomy diversity. And so this is a challenge that we have when addressing questions about changes in biodiversity through time. And so two of the sort of major ways that we do this in paleobiology are studying species richness curves or estimating origination and extinction rates. And in both cases, it's clearly essential that we attempt to mitigate the effects of incomplete and uneven sampling in the geological record. So to talk a little bit about how sort of the data that I'm talking about in the next part of this talk. So typically we obtain data either through collection or downloading it from a database like the PaleoDB. And this is the type of data I'm talking about in this next part of the talk, where we have information about taxa and the age of the occurrences in the fossil record that are associated with those taxa. And so we might have multiple taxa, given taxa represented multiple times. So then the next stage in our analysis might be to filter the data. And this is because almost all approaches in quantitative paleobiology used to estimate rates or richness involve eliminating data to account for incomplete sampling. And I'll talk more about that in the next few slides. And then the third step might be to estimate rates this is the divdin-R package. This is very useful for estimating parameters that we use in paleobiology. And then the output that I'm talking about here is estimates of origination and extinction, which we can obtain for different time intervals. So this is the input and output that I'm talking about in this part of the talk. And I want to emphasize that for the most part, approaches to dealing with uneven sampling in the fossil record almost always involve eliminating data to reduce the biases that are associated by unevenness. But before I talk about more about the FBD range process, I wanted to describe one such approach for estimating speciation extinction from fossil occurrence data. So you can think of there as being four distinct categories of taxa that you can assign to a geological interval. So we have those that are only sampled once within that interval. This is actually what we refer to as singletons. We have those that enter into the interval and then go extinct or have their last observation in that interval. Conversely, those that first originate within that interval, and those that range through the entire interval. And one way of estimating speciation and extinction rates based on this type of data is to simply use the proportion of first and last appearances that you observe in each interval. However, it's been shown that we need to exclude singletons from this calculation to reduce or eliminate bias that's caused by having these there. So including singletons in this calculation leads to underestimation of speciation and extinction rates. So these need to be excluded a priori from estimates of speciation and extinction. This is the boundary crosser method, which is one of the most widely used methods in paleobiology to obtain speciation and extinction rates. And when you have even sampling, but you exclude singletons, this approach produces unbiased estimates of speciation extinction. And this represents the probability that a species doesn't speciate within the interval. And then this can be this expression can be used to estimate speciation rates and conversely extinction rates. So what we want to do next is to talk about the application of the FBD range process for the analysis of fossil sampling times only. So previously I was talking about a scenario in which the aim was to perform tree inference in the case where we have characters and fossil sampling times. But now I want to talk about the use of the model when we have no character data, and the goal is not to inform the tree. And we can do this because the fossil sampling times are informative about the underlying speciation and extinction dynamics. So here I'm showing 3 trees simulated under different turnover rates, but with constant sampling. And what you can see is that different combinations of speciation and extinction lead to different tree shapes. And in turn, this leads to different distributions of fossil sampling times. And so in combination with this fossil recovery parameter, we obtain very different distributions that we can then use to inform these parameters. And I just wanted to add here that if you're interested in trying to learn more about these models, you can do so. You can check out the FossilSim package, also work led by Joël. So in this package, you can simulate fossils under a large range of models, but you can also use, there's a lot of plotting functions in the package that you can use to visualize the simulated data. And I think this helps getting a feel for how these parameters and the model assumptions behave. And you can also use these plotting functions to understand the difference between the reconstructed and complete trees. So yeah, check that out if you want to try to understand this in a bit more detail. And so coming back to this equation that we presented earlier, and so we introduced all these components, and I just want to show here how this changes when the goal is simply to estimate speciation and extinction rates when we only have stratigraphic ranges. And the good news is it makes everything much simpler. So here we have the priors on our model parameters. And then in this case, the likelihood comes from the FBD range model. And here we have a set of stratigraphic ranges rather than a tree, because in the absence of any character data, we can't infer the phylogenetic tree. So this simply describes the probability of describing a given set of stratigraphic ranges given their sampling times and the assumptions of the model. Then, as before, we have the marginal probability of the data, but here we only have fossil sampling times. And then our posterior distribution doesn't contain any trees because we're not estimating the topology, but instead we obtain the estimates of our model parameters, and the ones we would of course be interested in: speciation, extinction, and sampling. And for those of you familiar with the program Pyrate, this is equivalent to what's being done in Pyrate, and that was introduced by Daniela Silvestro. And so this is conceptually the same. So the key advantages of this approach are that the FBD range model explicitly incorporates incomplete sampling. And so singletons and unsampled lineages are an expected outcome of the process. So by explicitly incorporating incomplete sampling, we can include all available fossil data, including both extinct and extant singletons. And the FBD range process is the only model or the only approach that will allow you to incorporate information about samples that we only observe in the present. The approach accounts for uncertainty in the speciation and extinction times, which we sample using MCMC. And then we co-estimate the origination, extinction, and sampling parameters simultaneously for the entire data set. So we take into account everything that's going on between the beginning and the end of the process. And now I'm going to talk about some simulations and comparison to other approaches in this work that I did with Tanya and Tracy. And here we wanted to ask how the FBD range model compared to alternative methods. And in this study, we also explored in detail some of the issues that arise from dealing with incomplete sampling. So we first compared our model to a birth-death process model that assumes complete species sampling. And this is similar to the original model that was implemented in Pyrite, but I just want to emphasize that Pyrite has a large range of models and should soon also include the FBD range process. Then we compared it to these more traditional approaches used in paleobiology, including the boundary crosser method, which I introduced earlier. We also examined again the impact of including singletons. And then the three-timer approach is similar to the boundary crosser method, but it goes several steps further in accounting for incomplete sampling and actually requires eliminating more data than the boundary crosser method. So first I'm going to show just very briefly how the performance of this FBD range model compares to these alternative methods. So up here we have these three more traditional approaches used in paleobiology, then this birth-death process and the assumes complete species sampling, and the FBD range process. And here I'm showing in each box per interval sampling probability going from lowest to highest. And these are plots showing the percentage error that we obtain for extinction rate. And here what stands out is that if we assume complete species sampling, this model performs especially poorly when we have very low sampling. But as we increase sampling, this method improves. And then this per taxon method, which also includes singletons, gets worse as you add more data, because there's more and more singletons appear in your data. And this three-timer and boundary crosser method, these methods produce unbiased estimates of speciation and extinction rates, but we see the best performance using the FBD range process when sampling is low. So that's where we have a particular advantage using this approach. And we can directly attribute this to the fact that the FBD range model can utilize much more data. Here again, I'm showing different sampling scenarios from lowest to highest. And in each box, I'm showing the proportion of sampled taxa that are utilized by these different methods. And there's also this distinction here between, I'm showing what happens if we exclude and include if we exclude or include extant singletons. And essentially what we see quite clearly here is that we're able to utilize more data using these approaches that don't exclude singletons. And this even applies as sampling proportion increases because we have more and more singletons in the data. And essentially, this is valuable information that leads to improved estimates of parameters using the FBD range approach. Can we improve estimates of origination and extinction rates using this FBD range process? And the answer is yes, but we certainly have to be careful. So in our paper, we also explored the impact of model violation. And obviously, if we violate the assumptions of the model under certain circumstances, that's going to reduce the performance. And I wanted to talk about some of the challenges that we're going to encounter going forward using this model. But these are not issues that don't also apply to these other approaches. But to give you a flavor of the challenges, this is a figure from a really nice recent review paper looking at, among other things, issues created by sampling biases both in space and time in the fossil record. And yeah, we have both complex temporal and spatial incompleteness. But this figure on the left here is showing the representation of terrestrial environments in the fossil record over time. And what you can see is that using these alternative ways of measuring this representation, both of them increase considerably towards the present. And then what we're seeing on the right here is global terrestrial tetrapod diversity, and shown in red is a face value count of genus richness, and then in blue here is the diversity curve we obtain if we sample standardize, so accounting for uneven sampling. And the main point here is that we obtain very different estimates. And in both cases, we do have this increase towards the present. And the question remains whether this is real or whether we're still, even though we're sample standardizing the data, like whether this is real or we're still encountering an artifact caused by incomplete sampling. And I think a next big question for those of us working on the FBD range process is to what extent can we disentangle the parameters that are of sampling and diversification. So just to kind of briefly conclude, so I presented the FBD range process that we can use in addition to the FBD specimen level process for tree inference in the scenario when we have character and fossil age data. And now we also have the FBD range process for the analysis of fossil sampling times. And this increases the potential for what we can achieve using this explicit modeling framework in paleobiology. And I think the key here, or one of the keys, is that this approach allows us to integrate more information or include more data in our inference. And for some future perspectives, so the FBD skyline model, which allows us to produce per interval sampling parameters, was recently implemented by Will Pett in RevBase. So that's now available for anyone to use. When we include information about stratigraphic ranges, we also need to make a statement about the speciation process. And so the original description of the FBD range model also includes options for modeling these distinct processes of speciation, so budding, bifurcation, and anagenesis. And if you want to read more about how these processes relate to birth-death models, you can read about that in this paper I have here with Daniela. But now that we can explicitly include this information into our tree inference, this creates potential for us to test hypotheses about the process of speciation. So that's also something exciting to look forward to. I also wanted to mention the occurrence birth-death process, which was developed by Jeremy Andrioletti and Antoine Zwans, who were two students in Tanja Stadler's group. And in this paper, we present also an implementation in RevBase of what we call the occurrence birth-death process. And this allows us to treat as distinct sampling process is the inclusion of fossil taxa in the tree and also those external to the tree. So again, this is another way of maximizing the amount of information that we include in our inference. Informing these models remains a huge challenge, and I think this is a good place for me to kind of leave off and let you look forward to more of the challenges that Joelle will discuss in her next talk. But a big aspect of these challenges, in my experience, is that often those of us working with the models don't understand the data very well, or the opposite. So those of us working with the data also don't understand the details of these models necessarily. And so I think the most kind of productive way to move forward is to continue to strengthen our collaborations between empirical and theoretical researchers. I think this is really essential. And I'm going to end with a couple of pictures from the field. I was very lucky recently to go on a field trip to the Swedish island of Gotland, which is very famous for its amazing fossils from the Paleozoic. And here it was really another experience of kind of being just sort of what am I trying to say? Sorry. It was just an opportunity for me to think about the complexity in how we collect fossil data, and trying to put together like the process of actually going into the field and collecting fossil occurrence data and trying to match that with the assumptions that our models make is very challenging. And I found it extremely informative to think more closely about how we actually get data from the field into these databases, and then how do those translate to the assumptions that we're making when we go to analyze that data. And this site here on the right, this is where I found my first trilobite, in case of interest. But yeah, thank you very much to my co-authors. I've learned a tremendous amount from all these people here, and I've separated the Conodont club down here, but these groups aren't really mutually exclusive. So thank you very much, and with that, I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much, Rachel. That was a really nice talk. I confess that my mind was exploding when you said we're going to do this analysis with no character data. And so, I mean, I guess, first of all, I just should invite more questions on the chat. But let's see. Yeah, this just feels very non-traditional for a phylogenetics talk. And that's... but I mean, okay, now that once I sort of got over my initial shock, I mean, so can we just talk a little bit about, like, I'm just trying to imagine speciation rates and things like that. I guess all the information is there in just like the occurrence of like you have a new species, even though you have no idea how it relates to the other species.
Yeah, so a couple of points. I guess the first one is that like even though we can't like even though we can't infer the phylogenetic tree, we do know that underlying our fossil occurrence data, there is a tree generating process. So it is there even if we can't infer it. And I guess it's equivalent to, or it is equivalent to, like running the phylogenetic analysis under the tree prior. And like if you do this and you only have like sampling time information, this is informative about the priors. So even before you add your molecular sequence data. So we're essentially like integrating out over all possible topologies in this approach.
So maybe, yeah, can you help me understand? So I guess since this is being run in RevBase, there is implicitly a tree that you are integrating out. It's not as if you can calculate the likelihood integrating out the structure of the tree.
Actually, conceptually there's a tree, but actually you don't need to sample it. There's like a trick you can add to the, there's a trick you can do that basically means you integrate out the topology without having to perform all the moves in like using the MCMC machinery. But if you wanted to, you could also do that. Like that would be an equivalent approach if you, you would get the same results if you essentially just ran your analysis under the prior.
certainly preferable to integrate out the tree if you can. That's super cool. And so the MCMC is really about just these model parameters then, like these continuous model parameters.
Yeah.
Cool. So do you assume that the stratigraphic range is something that you can know exactly?
No, we also have like, well, it depends what you mean. We don't know the exact time of the first and last appearance.
Mhm.
There's also age uncertainty associated with those times. And then, yeah, the ends of the range are kind of characterized by like the same taxa. So this is defined by like, these are like morphospecies. If that makes sense. So we don't really explore the possibility that there are multiple species that could represent a single stratigraphic range, if that's what you mean.
Okay, I think I get it. But in practice, like, is it difficult to understand if you are seeing a fossil that is the same species or not when you're looking at a fossil?
Yes. So I think sometimes it's very well defined for certain groups of taxa, like the conodonts, for example, because they're used to date for biostratigraphic dating. So there are like some morphotypes that are associated with specific windows of time in the geological record. And the beginning and ends of those ranges are like well characterized. And like obviously in that circumstance you want or you prefer to use a taxon that does kind of cleanly disappear at a certain point in time. But there will be other circumstances in which you have this more gradual evolution or this gradual transition from like one morphotype to another. And I guess like we haven't explored the application of this model too much yet. But it will be interesting to think about how we deal with some of those scenarios. But one thing we can do is we can test whether one stratigraphic range is a sampled ancestor of another. But I think we also have to think about how we model the process of morphological evolution as well within this context. And I believe Will has also been working on some novel approaches for doing that.
Cool. I just have one more question, which which is really what do the classical paleobiologists think about all this? I mean, in a sense, like this is from my perspective. I mean, I recognize a lot of these things. I mean, obviously, having no character data seems a little bit unusual, but I mean, basically, this is a process that I'm familiar with from phylogenetics. But it must feel a little bit foreign for some of the classical paleobiologists. What is their response?
Well, many paleobiologists are really excited about this like area of research because it opens up all these possibilities to integrate different types of data, and also to do things in this like probabilistic Bayesian framework, which has many advantages. I think one of the like huge challenges for me on working but this goes both ways, and it's kind of what I was wanting to emphasize at the end, is that explaining all the important details associated with these models is really challenging. So it was, I guess, like really challenging for me to understand to begin with, and then it's sort of then challenging to impart that knowledge. But at the same time, it's also really challenging for paleobiologists to really explain the complexity of the data they're working with. But at the end of the day, it's sort of the most important like data we have is the fossil record for understanding biodiversity through time. So we have to sort of reconcile ourselves some way. But from a practical perspective, one of our challenges is that these methods are very computationally intensive compared to traditional approaches. And so that's another challenge that we have to kind of work through as well.
It looks like we have one question from the field. So Martin Smith says, an encouraging result that adding stratigraphic data improves the precision of inference. Were you able to quantify the degree to which precision was improved?
No, we haven't done that, but that would be a good thing to explore. I think perhaps more explicitly using simulations. I think that would be a good. I think that would be a good thing to do. So yeah, no, that's a good idea.
Cool. All right. Well, thanks again. We're at the end of our time, and we will look forward to Joelle's talk coming up.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.